The morning sun cast long shadows across Westminster as Harold Mitchell walked slowly down the familiar street. At 78 years old, his steps were measured and deliberate, each one a testament to the determination that had carried him through nearly 8 decades of life. His weathered hands gripped a simple wooden cane that had been his companion for the past 5 years, the worn handle polished smooth by countless hours of use. The medals on his worn navy blue jacket caught the light occasionally, remnants of his service in the Royal Navy decades ago. When he was young and strong, Harold's face bore the lines of a man who had lived through both triumph and tragedy. Deep wrinkles around his eyes spoke of years spent squinting into ocean spray during his naval service, while the gentle curve of his mouth suggested a man who had maintained his capacity for kindness. Despite the hardships life had thrown his way, his silver hair was neatly combed, and despite his obvious physical limitations, he carried himself with the dignity that came from a lifetime of service to his country. The morning ritual had become sacred to Harold. Every Tuesday for the past 3 years he made this same journey to the small clinic, where he received treatment for the arthritis that had gradually claimed the flexibility in his joints. The condition was a cruel reminder of age, transforming simple tasks like buttoning his shirt or opening jars into daily challenges that required patience and determination. The doctors and nurses at the clinic knew Harold well, greeting him with warm smiles and gentle patience as he navigated the challenges that came with age. Dr. Sarah Williams, a kind woman in her 40s, had become particularly fond of the elderly veteran. She always took extra time to listen to his stories about his naval service. Understanding that these memories were among Harold's most precious possessions, today felt different somehow, though Harold couldn't quite place why. Perhaps it was the unusual chill in the October air, or maybe it was the way the morning light seemed sharper than usual. He had learned over the years to trust his instincts, a skill that had served him well during his decades at sea. Something felt off, but he couldn't identify exactly what was troubling him as he made his way through the bustling streets of London. Harold observed the city waking up around him. Office workers hurried past with their coffee cups and briefcases, their faces buried in their phones as they navigated their morning routines. Young mothers pushed strollers while juggling shopping bags and trying to keep older children in line. The familiar sounds and smells of the city provided a comforting backdrop to his slow progress. Harold's mind often wandered during these walks, drifting back to memories of his younger days when he could stride confidently through any terrain. He remembered the feeling of a ship's deck beneath his feet, the way the ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, and the camaraderie he had shared with his fellow sailors. Those had been challenging times, but they had also been filled with purpose and brotherhood. The elderly veteran had lost his wife Margaret 3 years ago, and these weekly trips to the clinic had become one of his few regular outings. Margaret had been the love of his life for over 50 years, and her absence still felt like a physical weight on his chest. She had been the one who encouraged him to seek treatment for his arthritis, worried about his increasing difficulty with mobility. As he turned the corner near the government buildings, Harold noticed a group of young men gathered near the bus stop. Their voices were loud and aggressive, their body language suggesting barely contained violence. Several wore hooded sweatshirts, despite the mild weather, and their conversation was punctuated with crude language and harsh laughter. Other pedestrians had already begun crossing to the opposite side of the street. Instinctively recognizing the potential for trouble, Harold paused for a moment, considering whether he should alter his route. The practical part of his mind suggested taking the longer path around the block, avoiding any potential confrontation. But Harold had never been one to back down from a challenge, even at his advanced age. His naval training had instilled in him a sense of determination that age had not diminished. The group consisted of 5 young men, none of whom appeared to be older than 25. Their leader was tall and lean, with multiple tattoos covering his arms and neck. His eyes held a coldness that Harold recognized from his years of service, the look of someone who enjoyed causing pain to others. The others seemed to defer to him, seeking his approval with nervous laughter and aggressive posturing. Harold noticed that the young men were blocking the sidewalk, forcing other pedestrians to step into the street or find alternative routes. An elderly woman with a shopping cart had already been forced to backtrack, her face showing fear and frustration. A businessman in an expensive suit had crossed the street rather than risk a confrontation. Glancing nervously over his shoulder as he hurried away, the veteran's military training, though decades old, still whispered reminders about maintaining composure under pressure and assessing potential threats. He had learned long ago that showing fear only made situations worse, and that bullies often back down when faced with calm confidence. His grip tightened slightly on his cane as he continued forward, hoping to pass by without incident. The morning that had started so peacefully, with Harold looking forward to his routine medical appointment and perhaps a cup of tea afterward, was about to take a dark turn that would change everything. The elderly veteran had no way of knowing that his decision to continue on his usual path would soon put him at the center of events that would test not only his own courage, but also challenge a young soldier's understanding of duty and honor. As Harold approached the group of young troublemakers, he tried to project an air of quiet confidence, hoping that his military bearing might discourage any confrontation. He had no way of knowing that his slow pace and obvious physical limitations had already marked him as a target in the minds of the young men who were looking for someone vulnerable to victimize. The confrontation began subtly with mocking whispers and barely contained snickers as Harold approached the group. The young men had noticed his slow, deliberate pace and the way he relied heavily on his wooden cane for support. Their leader, a thin young man with cruel eyes and a spiderweb tattoo covering the left side of his neck, nudged his companions and pointed in Harold's direction with a malicious grin. The initial comments were barely audible, designed to test Harold's reaction and gauge whether he would be an easy target. They made jokes about his age, suggesting that he belonged in a nursing home rather than wandering the streets alone. One of them, a stocky young man with gold teeth, mimicked Harold's careful gait, exaggerating his movements while the others laughed appreciatively. Harold heard their comments but chose to ignore them, hoping that his lack of reaction would convince them to lose interest. He had encountered bullies before, both in his youth and during his years of naval service, and he understood that engagement often escalated situations unnecessarily. His strategy was to maintain his dignity while passing through their territory, as quickly as his physical limitations would allow. Unfortunately, Harold's dignified silence only seemed to encourage their cruel behavior. The leader stepped forward, blocking Harold's path more directly, while his companions spread out to form a loose semicircle. Their body language had shifted from casual harassment to something more predatory, and Harold realized that his hope of avoiding confrontation had been naive. The verbal assault intensified as the young men grew bolder. They made crude comments about Harold's age and appearance, suggesting that old people like him were a burden on society. One of them noticed the medals on Harold's jacket and began making mocking references to his military service, questioning whether he had actually seen any real action or had simply sat safely behind a desk. Harold's jaw tightened at the insults, directed toward his service record, but he maintained his composure. He had spent 3 years aboard a destroyer during the Falklands conflict, and those experiences had taught him valuable lessons about courage and sacrifice. The young men mocking him had no understanding of what real service meant. But Harold refused to be drawn into an argument that would only make his situation worse. The leader pushed Harold's shoulder roughly, causing the elderly man to stumble backward several steps. Harold's grip tightened on his cane as he worked to maintain his balance, his heart beginning to race with a mixture of fear and rising anger. The physical contact had crossed a line, transforming verbal harassment into assault, and Harold knew that the situation was spiraling beyond his control. The other young men laughed louder at their leader's actions. Emboldened by the sight of the elderly veteran struggling to stay upright, one of them made a comment about how easy it would be to knock Harold down completely, while another suggested that they should take his cane away just to watch him fall. Their laughter had taken on a distinctly vicious quality that chilled Harold to the bone. What started as verbal harassment quickly escalated into something far worse. A stocky young man with gold teeth moved behind Harold, while the leader continued to face him directly. Without warning, he kicked at Harold's legs, trying to sweep them out from under him. Harold managed to avoid falling but felt his knees buckled dangerously as he fought to maintain his balance. Another attacker, a pale young man with multiple facial piercings, knocked Harold's cane from his hands with a swift kick, sending it clattering. Across the pavement several feet away, without his primary means of support, Harold swayed dangerously, his legs struggling to keep him upright. The loss of his cane was devastating, leaving him feeling utterly vulnerable and defenseless. The assault became more violent and coordinated as the group surrounded Harold completely. Hands shoved him from different directions, preventing him from regaining his stability or reaching his fallen cane. Harold found himself unable to defend against multiple attackers, his aged body struggling to respond to the threats coming from all sides. Passersby on the other side of the street noticed the commotion but seemed reluctant to intervene. Some pulled out their phones, whether to call for help or simply record the incident. Harold couldn't tell. A few people shouted at the attackers to stop, but none were willing to physically step in and help the elderly veteran. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming as Harold realized that no immediate help was coming from the gathering crowd of onlookers. The attack reached its peak when the leader, frustrated by Harold's refusal to beg or cry, delivered a particularly vicious shove with both hands. The force sent Harold tumbling backward, his arms flailing desperately as he tried to break his fall. The impact with the concrete sidewalk was brutal and sickening. The sound of Harold's head striking the pavement, echoing off the nearby buildings, pain exploded through Harold's skull as his vision began to blur and darken around the edges. He could taste blood in his mouth, metallic and warm, and he felt a wet sensation spreading through his hair that he knew meant he was bleeding heavily from his scalp. The world seemed to tilt and spin around him as consciousness began to slip away, lying on the cold pavement. Harold struggled desperately to stay aware of his surroundings as the young men continued their assault. He felt kicks connecting with his ribs and legs, each impact sending fresh waves of agony through his battered body. The attackers seemed to be enjoying his helplessness, their laughter becoming even more cruel and heartless as they realized how completely they had destroyed his ability to defend himself. The morning sun that had seemed so warm and welcoming just minutes before now felt harsh and unforgiving as Harold's world began to fade. His last clear thought before losing consciousness was a prayer that someone, anyone, would find the courage to help him before it was too late. From his position near the ornate gates of Buckingham Palace, Sergeant James Crawford had been observing the growing disturbance down the street with increasing concern. As a member of the Queen's Guard, James was trained to maintain his post, regardless of external distractions, but something about this particular situation troubled him deeply. His training demanded absolute focus on his ceremonial duties. Yet his instincts as a soldier and human being were screaming that something terrible was happening just a few hundred yards away. James had been standing guard for nearly 2 hours, his tall frame rigid in the traditional red uniform that had become an iconic symbol of British tradition. The heavy woolen tunic, despite being designed for ceremonial purposes, was uncomfortably warm in the October morning sun. His distinctive bearskin hat, standing 18 inches tall and weighing nearly 2 pounds, required careful balance and had long since ceased to feel natural despite his years of experience wearing it. At 32 years old, James was a seasoned soldier with 12 years of military service behind him. He had joined the army straight out of school, driven by a desire to serve his country and follow in the footsteps of his grandfather, who had served with distinction during World War II. His path to the Queen's Guard had been earned through exceptional performance in his previous postings, including 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan, where he had demonstrated both courage under fire and natural leadership abilities. The role of a Queen's Guard required a unique combination of military precision and theatrical performance. Tourists from around the world came to see the famous red-coated soldiers standing motionless at their posts, and James had learned to ignore their cameras, questions, and occasional attempts to make him break character. The discipline required was extraordinary, demanding the ability to remain perfectly still for hours while maintaining constant awareness of potential security threats. Through his peripheral vision, which had been trained to capture movement, while his head remained perfectly still, James could see the elderly man being surrounded by the group of young thugs Now, the distance made it difficult to discern exact details, but the body language of the attackers was unmistakably aggressive and threatening. Every instinct in James's body screamed at him to intervene, but his training held him in place like invisible chains. The internal conflict raging within James was intense and painful. Royal guards were not permitted to leave their posts except under the most extreme circumstances, such as direct threats to the royal family or specific orders from superior officers. Abandoning his position could result in court-martial dismissal from the guard and the end of his military career. The consequences of breaking protocol were severe and well understood by every soldier who wore the red uniform. James had witnessed the rigorous discipline enforced within the Queen's Guard throughout his 3 years of service in this elite unit. He had seen good soldiers face serious consequences for minor infractions, and he understood that the military's commitment to protocol was absolute. The tradition and honor of the Guard depended on every soldier's unwavering commitment to duty. Regardless of personal feelings or external circumstances, the sounds of the assault grew louder and more disturbing, carrying across the street despite the traffic noise and general bustle of central London. James could hear what sounded like an elderly man's cries of pain mixed with the cruel laughter of his attackers. Other pedestrians had gathered to watch, but none seemed willing to step forward and help. The sergeant's jaw clenched beneath ceremonial uniform as he struggled with the impossible choice before him. Years of military service had instilled in James a deep respect for duty and protocol. He understood that his role as a royal guard required absolute discipline and unwavering commitment to his assigned responsibilities. The ceremonial nature of his position did not diminish its importance, as the Queen's Guard represented centuries of British military tradition and the symbolic protection of the monarchy itself. But James also understood that being a soldier meant protecting those who could not protect themselves, especially the elderly, children, and other vulnerable members of society. His grandfather had taught him that true military honor came not from blind obedience to rules, but from the courage to do what was right when it mattered most. The old man's words echoed in James's mind as he watched the assault continue to unfold. The moment that changed everything came when James saw the elderly veteran collapse to the ground, his head striking the pavement with a sound that made the sergeant's stomach turn. Even from his distant position, James could see that the fallen man was not moving, and the attackers showed no signs of stopping their brutal assault. The realization hit James like a physical blow. He was possibly witnessing a murder in progress. The internal battle that had been raging in James's mind for several minutes suddenly crystallized into perfect clarity. His commanding officer's voice echoed in his memory, reminding him of the consequences of leaving his post and the importance of maintaining military discipline at all costs. But louder than that voice was his own conscience, telling him that some things were more important than following orders, and that true honor sometimes required personal sacrifice. James thought of his grandfather, who had stormed the beaches of Normandy and faced down Nazi machine guns to protect freedom and innocent life. He thought of the oath he had taken when he first became a soldier, promising to defend those who could not defend themselves. He thought of the elderly man lying motionless on the pavement while his attackers continued their vicious assault, and he realized that this was his defining moment as both a soldier and a human being. In that crucial instant, Sergeant James Crawford made a decision that would change his life forever. The weight of protocol and military discipline that had held him in place suddenly felt insignificant compared to the moral imperative of saving an innocent life. Without hesitation, he abandoned his ceremonial post and began running toward the scene of the attack, his heavy boots pounding against the pavement as he prepared to face whatever consequences might come from his choice to put humanity before protocol. The transformation from ceremonial guard to active soldier was immediate and complete. James's training kicked in as he assessed the tactical situation while running, his mind automatically calculating the best approach to neutralize multiple attackers while minimizing harm to the victim. The bearskin hat that had been perfectly positioned moments before now bounced awkwardly with each stride. But James's focus was entirely on reaching the elderly man before it was too late to save him. James's approach across the busy London street was swift and commanding. his red uniform and distinctive appearance immediately drawing attention from everyone in the vicinity. His military training kicked in as he assessed the situation while running, automatically cataloging the number of attackers, their positions, and the condition of the victim. The sight of a royal guard abandoning his post and charging toward them with obvious intent caught the attention of the attackers, who suddenly found their confidence beginning to waver. The transformation in the group's behavior was immediate and dramatic. What had been cruel confidence just moments before quickly shifted to uncertainty and fear as they realized that their victim now had a formidable defender. Several of the younger members began glancing around nervously, looking for escape routes and clearly having second thoughts about their involvement in the assault. The sergeant's voice boomed across the street, with an authority that came from years of military command and training. His words carried the weight of absolute authority as he ordered the young men to step away from Harold immediately, his tone leaving no room for argument or negotiation. The power of his presence, combined with his imposing uniform and obvious military bearing, created an instant shift in the dynamics of the situation. James had learned during his years of service how to project authority and command respect through his voice and bearing. His training in crowd control and de-escalation techniques had taught him that often the threat of force was more effective than force itself, and that a commanding presence could often resolve situations without violence. However, he was also prepared to use whatever force was necessary to protect the injured veteran. Some of the attackers immediately began to back away from Harold's motionless form, recognizing that they had crossed a line that would bring serious consequences. Their earlier bravado evaporated in the face of a trained soldier who clearly meant business. They began to understand that their fun had turned into something that could result in criminal charges and imprisonment. But their leader, perhaps driven by pride, stupidity, or the need to maintain his reputation in front of his followers, decided to challenge the approaching guard. He shouted threats and obscenities at James, trying to maintain control over his group and the situation. His posturing was clearly an attempt to show that he was not intimidated by the uniform or the authority it represented. The leader's defiance was short-lived. However, as James reached the scene and positioned himself between Harold's fallen form and the remaining attackers, his military experience and physical conditioning were immediately evident as he assessed the threat level and prepared to neutralize any further violence. The contrast between the trained soldier and the street thugs was stark and unmistakable. James's training in crowd control and conflict resolution became evident as he used his physical presence and commanding voice to disperse the group. He understood that his goal was to protect Harold and prevent further violence, not to engage in unnecessary confrontation. His approach was professional and measured, designed to achieve maximum effect with minimum escalation. The sight of a royal guard willing to break protocol to intervene sent a clear message about the seriousness of their actions and the consequences they would face. James's presence transformed what had been a one-sided assault on a helpless elderly man into a confrontation between trained military personnel and common criminals, a fight that the thugs clearly could not win. The confrontation with the remaining attackers was brief but intense. When the leader attempted to strike James with a wild, clumsy punch, the sergeant easily deflected the attack using techniques learned during his years of combat training. His response was controlled and precise, designed to neutralize the threat without causing unnecessary harm, demonstrating the difference between professional military training and street violence. James's counterattack was swift and decisive. A single, well-placed blow sent the leader stumbling backward. His earlier bravado completely deflated as he realized he was facing someone far more skilled and dangerous than an elderly veteran. The message was clear and unmistakable. Further, violence would be met with overwhelming force from a trained professional. The remaining members of the group, seeing their leader so easily defeated, lost whatever courage they might have had. The reality of their situation finally penetrated their earlier excitement. They were assaulting an innocent man in broad daylight, in front of multiple witnesses, and now faced the prospect of serious legal consequences. Within minutes, the entire group had scattered like leaves in the wind. running in different directions as they desperately tried to escape the scene before police arrived. Their earlier unity and shared cruelty dissolved instantly when faced with real consequences, revealing them to be nothing more than cowards who preyed on the weak and vulnerable. The presence of witnesses and the involvement of a royal guard meant that they would likely face consequences for their actions, assuming they could be identified and apprehended by police. Several onlookers had been recording the incident on their phones, providing evidence that would make prosecution much easier. With the immediate threat neutralized and the attackers dispersed, James turned his full attention to Harold, who remained motionless on the cold pavement. The elderly veteran's breathing was shallow and irregular, and blood was clearly visible on his face and clothing. James felt his heart sink as he took in the extent of Harold's injuries and realized how serious the situation had become. James knelt beside Harold, his military first aid training taking over as he began to assess the extent of the veteran's injuries. He checked for vital signs, looking for signs of serious head trauma or internal injuries that might require immediate medical intervention. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he examined Harold's condition while being careful not to move him unnecessarily. The sergeant spoke to Harold in calm, reassuring tones, hoping that some part of the elderly man's mind could hear him and understand that help had finally arrived. Even though Harold appeared to be unconscious, James knew that hearing was often the last sense to fade, and he wanted to provide whatever comfort he could while waiting for professional medical assistance to arrive. James immediately called for medical assistance using his military radio, requesting both an ambulance and police response to their location with urgent priority. His training had taught him the critical importance of quick medical intervention. In cases involving head trauma and potential internal injuries, especially in elderly patients whose bodies were less capable of recovering from serious trauma. While waiting for help to arrive, he continued to monitor Harold's vital signs and provide whatever comfort and reassurance he could offer. The crowd of onlookers had grown significantly larger, with many people now approaching to offer assistance, or simply to witness the aftermath of the brutal attack. James took immediate charge of the chaotic scene, his military leadership training allowing him to organize the situation effectively. He directed people to give Harold adequate space to breathe while asking potential witnesses to remain available. For police questioning when officers arrived, several Good Samaritans offered to help in whatever way they could. A nurse who had witnessed the attack from across the street came forward to assist with Harold's medical care, providing professional support while they waited for paramedics. An elderly gentleman retrieved Harold's fallen cane and stood guard over it, understanding its importance to the injured veteran. Others formed a protective circle around Harold, shielding him from curious onlookers and giving him some privacy during his vulnerable state. James's natural leadership abilities shone through as he coordinated the various offers of help and maintained order in what could have easily become a chaotic situation. His calm, authoritative presence provided stability and reassurance to everyone present, demonstrating the same qualities that had made him an effective soldier throughout his military career. Within minutes, the distinctive sound of emergency sirens could be heard in the distance, growing progressively louder as ambulances and police vehicles approached their location. James felt a mixture of profound relief and growing apprehension, knowing that medical help was finally coming for Harold, but also acutely aware that his own actions would soon come under intense scrutiny from his military superiors. The paramedics arrived first, their vehicle pulling up to the curb with lights flashing as two experienced emergency medical technicians quickly exited with their equipment. They immediately took over Harold's medical care with professional efficiency and expertise, carefully examining his injuries, checking his vital signs, and beginning the process of stabilizing his condition for transport to the hospital. The lead paramedic, a woman in her 40s with years of emergency medicine experience, worked quickly to assess Harold's neurological status and determine the extent of his head injuries. She asked James detailed questions about what he had witnessed and the nature of the attack, helping her understand the mechanism of Harold's injuries and anticipate potential complications. James provided the medical team with comprehensive information about the assault, describing how Harold had been pushed and had fallen backward, striking his head on the concrete sidewalk. He explained that the elderly man had been unconscious for several minutes, and that his breathing had been irregular since the attack. This information was crucial in helping the paramedics understand the severity of Harold's condition. The medical team worked with practiced efficiency, carefully immobilizing Harold's neck and spine before moving him. Understanding that head injuries often came with associated spinal trauma, they started an intravenous line to maintain his blood pressure and administered oxygen to ensure adequate brain oxygenation. Their professional competence was reassuring to James, who understood that Harold was now receiving the best possible care. As Harold was being carefully loaded into the ambulance on a stretcher, he briefly regained consciousness for the first time since the attack. His eyes were unfocused and confused, clearly indicating some level of head trauma. But he seemed to recognize that someone in a red military uniform was nearby. The sight of James's distinctive bearskin hat and red tunic seemed to register in Harold's injured mind. With tremendous effort and obvious pain, Harold managed to whisper a weak thank you to James, his voice barely audible over the noise of the emergency response and street traffic. The words carried enormous weight, representing not just gratitude for the immediate rescue, but recognition of one soldier's service by another who understood the meaning of courage and sacrifice. James felt his throat tighten with emotion as he heard Harold's words. Understanding that this elderly veteran had recognized him as a fellow soldier, despite his injuries and confusion, the moment created a powerful connection between two men from different generations who shared a common commitment to service and protecting others. Police officers arrived shortly after the ambulance, beginning the systematic process of documenting the incident and interviewing the numerous witnesses who had observed the attack and its aftermath. They immediately recognized the unusual nature of the situation, involving both a brutal assault on an elderly veteran and the extraordinary response of a royal guard who had abandoned his post to intervene. The investigating officers spoke with James at length, recording his detailed account of the attack and his decision to leave his ceremonial position to help Harold. They were particularly interested in his observations of the attackers, hoping to gather enough information to identify and apprehend the perpetrators. James answered their questions thoroughly and honestly, knowing that his testimony would be crucial in any subsequent prosecution. The police also interviewed multiple civilian witnesses, gathering a comprehensive picture of the events that had unfolded. Their testimonies consistently praised James's intervention and described the severity of the attack on Harold. Several people had recorded portions of the incident on their phones, providing valuable video evidence that would support any criminal charges. James's commanding officer arrived on the scene within 30 minutes of being notified of the situation by police dispatch. Colonel William Hartwell was a stern man in his 50s with over 25 years of military service, and his expression was carefully controlled as he surveyed the situation and spoke briefly with the investigating officers. James knew that he would face serious questions about his decision to abandon his post, regardless of the circumstances. The colonel approached James with the formal bearing expected of a senior military officer, his face revealing nothing about his thoughts or intentions regarding the unprecedented situation. He requested a brief preliminary report from James, which the sergeant provided in the concise, factual manner expected in military communications. The colonel listened without comment, taking notes and asking only essential clarifying questions. As the ambulance departed with Harold inside, James watched it disappear into the heavy London traffic, hoping and praying that the elderly veteran would make a full recovery from his injuries. The immediate crisis was over, but James understood that the consequences of his actions were just beginning to unfold. He had broken one of the most fundamental rules of Royal Guard service to save a life, and now he would have to face whatever punishment that decision might bring. The colonel informed James that he would be relieved of his post for the remainder of the day and would be required to report for a formal inquiry the following morning. The tone was professional but serious, indicating that James's actions would be thoroughly investigated and that significant consequences were likely. James accepted the orders without question, understanding that he had chosen his course of action knowing full well what it might cost him professionally. The disciplinary hearing took place 3 days later in a formal military courtroom within the Wellington Barracks, the headquarters of the Guards Division. The room was austere and intimidating, with portraits of distinguished military leaders watching from the walls and the British flag displayed prominently behind the panel of officers who would decide James's fate. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of military tradition and the serious nature of the proceedings. James stood at rigid attention before a panel of 3 senior officers. Knowing that his entire military career hung in the balance, he wore his dress uniform, which had been meticulously prepared for the occasion. Understanding that appearance and military bearing would be scrutinized as carefully as his actions, the charges against him were serious and clearly stated: abandonment of post, failure to follow protocol, and conduct unbecoming of a royal guard. The presiding officer was Brigadier General Patricia Morrison, distinguished career soldier with over 30 years of service and a reputation for fairness combined with unwavering commitment to military discipline. Flanking her were Colonel James McLeod, a veteran of multiple combat deployments, and Major Sarah Fletcher, who had herself served with the Queen's Guard earlier in her career and understood the unique pressures and responsibilities of ceremonial duties. James's commanding officer, Colonel Hartwell, presented the case against him with professional thoroughness, outlining the strict regulations that govern Royal Guard behavior and emphasizing the critical importance of maintaining discipline and protocol at all times. The colonel's presentation was factual and unemotional, focusing on the clear violation of standing orders regardless of the circumstances that had motivated James's actions. The military's position was straightforward and uncompromising. Protocol existed for critically important reasons, and soldiers who ignored direct orders, regardless of their personal motivations or the outcomes of their actions, fundamentally undermined the entire military structure. The argument emphasized that allowing exceptions, even for seemingly noble reasons, would create dangerous precedents that could compromise military effectiveness and discipline. Colonel Hartwell presented evidence of James's exemplary service, record acknowledging his previous commendations and positive performance evaluations, but stressed that good past behavior did not excuse current violations of military law. The colonel also noted that Royal Guards were selected specifically for their ability to maintain discipline under any circumstances, making James's actions particularly serious within the context of his specialized role. However, the story had gained significant media attention in the days following the incident. Newspapers across Britain had picked up the story of the Royal Guard who had broken protocol to help an elderly veteran, and public opinion was overwhelmingly supportive of James's actions. Television news programs had featured interviews with witnesses who praised his courage and questioned whether military protocol should prevent soldiers from helping innocent victims of violent crime. The media coverage had created an unusual situation for the military, which found itself in the position of potentially disciplining a soldier who had become a public hero. Editorial writers and commentators had criticized the military's rigid adherence to protocol, arguing that true military honor sometimes required soldiers to act according to their conscience rather than simply following orders blindly. Social media had amplified the story even further, with hashtags supporting James trending on various platforms and thousands of people expressing their admiration for his actions. Veterans organizations had issued statements supporting James, arguing that his intervention represented the highest ideals of military service and that protecting innocent civilians was a fundamental duty that transcended ceremonial responsibilities. Several witnesses from the attack testified on James's behalf, providing detailed accounts of the brutal assault and Harold's desperate situation. They painted a vivid picture of the violence that had been inflicted on the elderly veteran and the complete lack of intervention from other civilians who had witnessed the attack. Their testimony highlighted the moral complexity of the situation James had faced and the life-or-death nature of his decision. Mrs. Elizabeth Chen, a teacher who had witnessed the entire incident while walking to work, provided particularly compelling testimony. She described the attacker's cruelty and Harold's helplessness, emphasizing that the elderly man would likely have died without James's intervention. Her emotional account brought tears to several people in the courtroom and clearly impacted the members of the panel. Harold himself, despite still recovering from his injuries and moving with obvious difficulty, insisted on attending the hearing to testify on James's behalf. Supported by a walker and accompanied by his daughter Margaret, named after his late wife, the elderly veteran made a powerful and emotional statement about James's actions that resonated throughout the courtroom. Harold's testimony was delivered in a clear, strong voice that belied his physical frailty. He described James as the man who had saved his life and argued passionately that true military honor sometimes required soldiers to put basic human decency above regulations and protocol. He spoke of his own naval service and the values he had learned about protecting those who could not protect themselves. The elderly veteran's words carried particular weight because of his own military background and his status as the victim of the attack. He spoke about the brotherhood that existed among those who had served their country and suggested that James's actions represented the highest traditions of British military service. His testimony was both moving and persuasive, clearly affecting everyone present.